As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
Most people have heard of this phrase, survival of the fittest. And at least what most people, I think, initially understand about that is that that means that we are ultimately selfish, right? And greedy and so forth. And it turns out that, well, it's more complicated than that. And yes, all of us do selfish things, but we also have this other capacity, which I think is just as tied to our origins as selfishness is. And we have the capacity for altruism and love and cooperation. It turns out that I think at least that we have these competing natures.
That was Dr. Sam Wilkinson on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, listeners. It's Emily, and I am here with Debbie today to introduce an episode with Dr. Samuel Wilkinson about his book, Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. So, Debbie, I'm so curious what you thought about this conversation.
Well, I really nerded out on this, Emily, because I love this kind of stuff. And let me just tell you a little personal background. As an undergraduate, I double majored in psychology and anthropology, and I took a lot of biology classes. And I think I just really loved trying to understand humans in all these different ways, like on all these different levels. And within the anthropology major, we did a lot on evolution, a lot on primate evolution and what makes humans unique and culture and these types of things, right? And it really kind of fit in nicely with the psychology classes I took and the bio classes I took, just to really have this full understanding of humans and what makes us unique as animal species and what makes us not that unique compared to the other primates and the other highly social mammals that are out there that live in groups. And of course, now I'm a therapist who is working with individual people. And surprisingly, a lot of this kind of comes into my mind as I work as a therapist, because I think sometimes it's really helpful to zoom way out and look at people from this very high level perspective to understand some of our behavior, some of our thoughts and emotions, and different aspects of our experience that are kind of, very deep and complex if you look at it contextually. And when I first started learning about acceptance and commitment therapy years and years ago, which is the main, therapy that I use, and I think all of us co-hosts have an interest in ACT and specialize in these behavioral treatments. Anyway, one of the things that I loved about it is that it's a functional contextual therapy, right? And so we are looking at human behavior in context. And to me, it's not just the immediate context of stimulus and response, right? It's our learning history. It's our biology. It's our culture. And, these evolutionary concepts and principles come into play with this. And so to me, it's really, really helpful. Like if you think about a given human behavior that someone is struggling with and they're coming into my office to talk to me about it, I can kind of get really into kind of looking at all these different layers of it. And it is relevant. And just as a quick example, which is something that you touch on a lot, actually, is that fundamentally we're such social creatures and we are very much evolved to survive in groups and to depend on each other. And so when you see people experiencing social and moral emotions like shame and guilt, and you see people get into people-pleasing behaviors, or you see the effects of isolation and, people who are struggling socially and just how deeply painful that can be, it's really helpful, I think, to look at that level, to look at, well, yeah, that's because, the way that a lot of people are living in our modern world is a bit of an evolutionary mismatch with human history and with our human nature. And so I just love you talk about all these kinds of questions and issues around human nature. So it was really an interesting one.
Yes, we get into really big questions that actually don't have answers, or they don't have clear, consistent answers. I think different answers could be debated by different people. And as psychologists or people working in the mental health field, what's really useful is how many different forces shape human behavior and how many different layers there are to the human experience. And so you brought up the mismatch with evolution, which I think about a lot as well in terms of, how our fear responses work these days are very overactive. We are not being chased by lions anymore, right? But our bodies think we are at times. And so I think there's really something to how our human brains are designed that are not matching our modern world that is really interesting, and then how our behaviors then manifest. But I really liked getting into the whole duality of human nature, and we spend a lot of time on that. And I think it's something, I'm an English major, I'm a huge reader, and this whole theme of good versus evil, right? And the morality tales, the heroes and the anti-heroes. I mean, it's everywhere, all through every form of entertainment in human history. And I think it's something we just all grapple with all the time, even down to which one am I? Or which side of myself am I nurturing or giving energy to? And I just think it's a really interesting philosophical debate.
Yeah, you can look at those shadow parts of yourselves. You can understand this conflict and how universal it is to all of us. And even the fact that we're having this conversation, you did this interview, we're grappling with these issues all the time. That is so very human, right? Like we are always trying to make meaning out of our experience and trying to understand it. And I think that is part of human nature that is so unique about us. And I don't know. I think it's really kind of funny to think about that. It's like, here we are doing the things that humans do best, which is to think about our own existence and make meaning out of it.
And really struggle to figure that out. Again, it's in the struggle, it's in the process, it's in the journey of being human to wonder and have curiosity about these big ideas. And that, like you said, is very human all on its own. So I really hope listeners have some deep thoughts while they listen. And here is the interview with Dr. Sam Wilkinson. Dr. Sam Wilkinson is Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Yale University, where he also serves as Associate Director of the Yale Depression Research Program. He received his MD from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His articles have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He has been the recipient of many awards, including top advancements and breakthroughs from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, top 10 psychiatry papers by the New England Journal of Medicine, the Samuel Nove Writing Prize in Psychological Medicine, the Thomas Detre Award, and the Seymour Lustman Award. He is the author of Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. Sam, welcome to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to answer everyone's most existential questions in under an hour.
Sounds great.
So I am not sure you could have chosen a harder book to write. You are essentially tackling these existential questions that we as a human race have been grappling with since forever. I'm sure there are hieroglyphs somewhere debating the innate nature of humans. So it's a very ambitious undertaking while also a very human one, because I think we all have these questions of things like, are humans innately good or evil? Why are we even here? I remember thinking about this even as a child, really wondering what is the point of existence. So I want to start with how you felt inspired and equipped to tackle these big questions.
Well, I'm not sure I've felt equipped the whole time, but I can certainly tell you how I started to become interested in this. And it actually goes back to really before I was a psychiatrist. I was a medical student, and in medicine, you don't really choose your specialty until the end of medical school. But as a first-year medical student, I had this sort of, I guess you would call it an existential crisis, where I had this sense that what I was learning in science, in my professional training, was at odds with the sense that I had, that most people have, that life has purpose and value and meaning. And really at the heart of it was the theory of evolution. And there are some of the leading thinkers in biology and evolution who have had this sort of framework that, look, life really is just an accident, and any sort of purpose or meaning that we ascribe to it is nice, but it's kind of not really deep, or it's just an illusion, right? And that didn't sit very well with me. And so I really dove in as best as I could to some of these topics. And after a little bit, I had this, it's hard to describe, but kind of a sort of epiphany where things seemed to come together in what for me was a beautiful way. And I decided at that point, I was still a medical student, I wanted to write a book. That was a long time ago. That was 15 years ago. I had to put it on the side. I have since, launched my career, and my wife and I have had 5 kids. And so I put it on the side for a while and came back to it. Really just COVID was setting in, and was able, after a couple of years of writing, to kind of pull it together. And it launched in a little earlier this year, March of 2024. So that's a little bit about what's inspired me. It was really this personal wrestle with, what is the meaning of life, or is there even one according to science? And does science have anything to contribute to this discussion?
Well, and I think you start the book with this argument that believing in evolution does not preclude having a religious or spiritual faith or belief system.
Yeah, that's one of the main purposes of why I wrote this book.
So say more about that, because I think that's an interesting debate in our modern society.
Yeah, there were a couple things about evolution that I initially didn't like, that were kind of off-putting. And we can go through them in whatever order you would like, or for much time we have, because these are, we could talk about these for a long time. But one is the sense that, this was a totally random and haphazard process. And especially in the last 10, 20 years, there's been a lot of compelling evidence to suggest that, well, actually, maybe that's not necessarily the case. A lot of this is the work of a very, very bright biologist by the name of Simon Conway Morris. He's at the University of Cambridge in England. another aspect, so that's one aspect, that this kind of this sense that life is an accident. The other part of evolution that I didn't like was what it implied, or what I thought it implied, about human nature. And most people have heard of this phrase, survival of the fittest. Biologists tend to use the term natural selection, but it kind of in a sense interchangeable. And at least what most people, I think, initially understand about that is that means that we are ultimately selfish, right, and greedy and so forth. And I didn't like that. It's kind of a bitter pill to swallow, a depressing view of human nature. And it turns out that, well, it's more complicated than that. And yes, it's easy to find examples in the history book of humanity of examples where we are selfish, and all of us do selfish things, but we also have this other capacity, which I think is just as tied to our origins as selfishness is. And we have the capacity for altruism and love and cooperation and so forth. And it's interesting. We can talk about where this comes from, or how does evolution explain, cooperation and love and so forth. But it's a much more complex picture than at least I originally understood about, what are the implications of the theory of evolution on human nature. Turns out that, I think at least, that we have these competing natures. It's not just one monolithic thing. We are pulled in different directions.
Yep.
So
what I found fascinating about the premise of the whole book is that we usually think about finding purpose or figuring out the meaning of life as a spiritual and psychological journey, but you present it with this biological evolutionary background. So I really found that just intellectually fascinating to overlay all of these different influences into one, when usually I think we separate them out. Okay, so let's get into the duality of human nature. Okay, so you've taken this on through the lens of evolutionary biology, psychology, sociology, and philosophy. So starting with the biological understanding of human behavior, because I'm going to start here and then we'll get into the dualities. We will get detailed into that.
Yeah.
But in terms of genetics, I was surprised that what I learned in high school biology, I still was thinking of Mendelian traits. I remember the squares, and if one parent has blue eyes and one parent has brown eyes, and you kind of plot out what the offspring is going to have with their DNA, right?
Yep.
But you upended this, or someone else has, and you explained it to us. But why is understanding genetics important for us to understand how that works when we're thinking about evolution?
Well, there's still a lot that we just don't know in this realm. And I pointed this argument out because I wanted to push back against this notion of behavioral or genetic determinism, this notion that, our fate is written and we can't, there's nothing that we can do to alter it. And I think that's false. And I think there's a lot of wiggle room in the way that our social traits unfold and develop and so forth. And it's not genetically predetermined. So this is the reason I bring this up. But as you point out, it is very true that we're not at all clear how physical traits are linked to our genetics, and much less so social and behavioral traits. Again, what you learn in elementary school or middle school is the smooth and the wrinkled peas. That's maybe one example where, quote, Mendelian genetics, or this relatively simple pattern, might hold. But it turns out that there aren't really examples of that, with the exception of disease, when something goes wrong. But for normal traits, we used to think that eye color was like that, but it's much, much more complex and determined by not just one gene, but a number of them interacting in ways that are just really mind-bogglingly complex.
Yeah, what comes to mind that's really salient in my life is height. Mm-hmm. So, as our kids are growing up, they're all really small on the growth chart. And they are just looking at us like, why are we so small? And, there's the formula that doctors use to this day, but it's not translating in our family. And we are feeding our children, but it just is an example of there's more to the story here. It's not a plug-in formula.
Yeah. I mean, certainly we all believe that genes influence these things, but the way they do it is not well understood. There's still a lot to kind of discover in this very complex mode of inheritance, right? Traits are passed down. That's definitely an observation that's been seen for many, many decades.
Right. There's an influence.
Yeah.
There's an influence, but it's not as deterministic as maybe we have been taught.
Yeah. And the other thing that's really interesting is it doesn't really make sense to say a gene does this. It makes sense to say a gene does this in a given environment. So
Yes.
Genes are turned on and turned off by certain environments. They could be the microenvironment, like in the cell right around the tissue. They could be the larger environment, the stimulations that we are exposed to in our, what we normally think of with the word environment.
Exactly. I was hoping we'd get to that.
Right.
Yeah. So that I think also ties into, you talk about multi-level selection. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So let's go back to this phrase, survival of the fittest. This phrase was coined not by Darwin, but by another biologist a few years after The Origin of Species, Darwin's most influential book, came out. And 1859 is when that book was published. And so let's think about this phrase, survival of the fittest. Multi-level selection essentially turns this into a question and asks, well, survival of the fittest what? Okay. And there's a couple different levels of organization that could be relevant here. Are we talking about survival of the fittest gene? Okay, gene-centered kind of evolution is something that there's a camp of people who have been in that corner and said this is really the only thing that matters. It's just the genes. Other people say, well, no, the individual obviously is really important. And then we can go even higher. We can say the kin level or even group level. And all these different levels, so survival of the fittest gene, survival of the fittest individual, survival of the fittest kin or group, all these different levels can have really profound implications for the social traits which emerge. And this is kind of at the core of one of the arguments that I make, especially with respect to human nature.
Right. You say that a trait that is a weakness in one context can be a strength in another.
Correct. In terms of social traits. Yeah.
Yep. You give an example about the hens that peck each other to death.
Yeah. So a group was trying to come up with more productive hens. And what they did is, and hens are housed maybe 6 to 9 per cage. And what they did is they would take the most productive hen from a couple of different cages, and they would put them all together. And what they found was this worked in the opposite way that they were hoping. And the hens that were most productive also tended to be very kind of selfish, and it ended up in this selected group of really productive hens. Some of them pecked each other to death, and so they weren't very productive in terms of egg production. And what turned out to be the right formula was to not take the best individual, but was to take the best group, the group that was most productive of hens, and then they would take the offspring from that and keep them together. And this turned out to achieve the goal that they were hoping, which was to increase egg production.
Such a fascinating example.
Yes.
I mean, it really drives home how we need to look at these ideas in a more complex way than, I love this, it's not about the individual. It's how the individual is interacting with their environment. It's what's happening at these higher levels of community. And we'll get into kind of how that translates to humans.
Yeah.
That we're not literally pecking each other to death, but there are.
Yeah, they're examples where, we stab each other in the back, so to speak,
right,
and in ways
right,
that are not helpful
right,
for individuals or communities. Can I share one other example that you may recognize? So that applies to humans. So I get this example from a colleague of mine here at Yale, Nicholas Christakis, about two shipwrecks at the same time and place. Right. So in the 1860s, in what's called the Auckland Islands, this is an archipelago about 300 miles off the coast of mainland New Zealand. There were two ships that crashed on opposite ends of these islands. And the islands are large enough that the survivors never bumped into one another. The first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. And after about a year and a half of this harrowing ordeal, much resourcefulness and ingenuity, all of the crew from Musgrave's ship survived and made it off the islands. The second ship was led by a man named George Dalgarno. Now, unfortunately, most of the crew from his ship died. Okay. And so you ask, well, what was the key difference? And the key difference was that Musgrave's group formed this remarkably cohesive and cooperative unit. And this was really epitomized in the first just minutes of the shipwreck, when Musgrave himself carried an injured man on his back as he swam through the waves to the safety of the shore, right after the shipwreck. Dalgarno's group, unfortunately, they took kind of an every man for himself approach. And there was this kind of ethos of selfishness. And this was seen within the first day or so when they left a wounded man behind on the beach. And they left a wounded man behind to die as they searched further inland for food and other resources. So you can think of, lots of similar scenarios that might have played out in our kind of ancient past, where it was cooperation and altruism and sticking together was what led to a survival advantage.
It reminds me of like really popular dystopian stories of late, like, I don't know if you've watched is it The Last of Us?
I'm not familiar with that one, but certainly, the Hunger Games,
yes, there's this.
What's the Squid Games or something?
Oh, yes.
These dystopian narratives where people are pitted against each other.
And there's a morality. There's sort of a decision point in these tales, and there's heroes and villains that emerge.
Yeah. So I think it's been several years, but you had on this podcast before David Sloan Wilson, and I think he really epitomized well in an article he did with the late Edward Wilson, how these different levels can produce different social traits, where they said, look, selfishness beats altruism within groups, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups, and everything else is commentary. And so the question is, well, which of these levels, was it the individual level or the group or kin level that emerged that was most important in our history? And my thesis is that they were both. Both of these had their roles in kind of the origin of our species. And as such, we find ourselves pulled in different directions. And we can certainly look through the history books and find examples, terrible examples of human selfishness and violence. But we can also find, and unfortunately, they sometimes don't get as much news press and coverage, but the examples of moral heroes, people who treat each other just treat others with remarkable kindness and generosity and so forth. So, just as one example, this woman named Barbara Goodson lived in Houston, and in 2015, she started offering free haircuts to homeless people. And it was first just a few cuts a month, and then she also started offering them to people who were just getting out of prison, and then to battered women. And this eventually led to this nonprofit organization that essentially offered this service for free to people who were kind of the outcasts of society. So history is full of both moral heroes and villains. And it's just this, I think we are both. For a lot of history, philosophers and social scientists have wrestled with, are we ultimately selfish or altruistic? And I think we have both capacities.
Yep. You've already jumped to the punchline.
Sorry.
Of where we land on this. And I think it is interesting as we get more into the details of the dualities, because what's interesting is this idea that this opposition of good and evil are almost required. Both are required for the other one to exist. So there's this sort of tension, or that is the definition of duality. There are two forces within all of us. So let's back up a little bit and get a little more granular about altruism versus selfishness. So tell me a little bit about the historical evidence on each side, that humans are altruistic or humans are selfish.
Well, I think when the theory of evolution was relatively new, people might have concluded that, look, this just means that at our core we are selfish. But even a casual observer will note that no, there's lots of examples, not just from humans but from animals, where organisms will behave in ways that are not selfish. And this was kind of a conundrum. This was an enigma for biologists. And in religion, you have the problem of evil, which is that if there is a God who is benevolent and all powerful and so forth, why is there evil? And the biologists had the opposite problem. They said, well, if it's survival of the fittest, how is there good, right? And so I think it was just biologists observing that, well, how do we account for the altruism that does exist? And there's a number of different mechanisms that likely have led to this. By the way, I don't think that they're necessarily mutually exclusive. We don't necessarily have to get into these, but there's things like direct reciprocity, which is kind of a tit for tat. There's indirect reciprocity, which underscores the importance of reputations in a small community. And then there's kin selection, which is essentially kind of this survival of the fittest operating on the level of the family. There's group selection. So all of these are kind of different potential ways that altruism might have been developed from evolution. I think to some extent, they're all true because, when we act in pro-social ways, when we do things for others, there's lots of different reasons we might be doing this, right? Sometimes it's maybe a superficial thing, like we hope this person can pay us back, tit for tat. A lot of, in social circles, our reputations are really important. We might do things because we want to remain in the good graces of others or to be seen in a certain light. Other times it's maybe a more like I'm doing this for the good of goodness, right? That's maybe a little harder to explain, but I think that is harder to explain from a naturalistic standpoint. But I think that is a real motivation in some cases. Certainly, families look out for each other. That's kind of from an evolutionary perspective, that's obvious why that would be favored. So there's all sorts of kind of levels of this and maybe potential ways this came about. And I think probably to some extent, there's truth to all of them.
Right. So let's get into aggression versus cooperation. So this is another duality that you take on. So again, we could point to a lot of historical evidence that humans are inherently aggressive.
Yeah.
But there's also evidence that we're inherently cooperative. So let's start with some of the evidence you present to explore the question, how much of aggression comes from biology and how much from culture?
Yeah, and that's kind of an impossible question to answer because they interact, right? The culture and biology interact. But one kind of story that I like to try to demonstrate a little bit about what is the aggressive aspect of humans. When we talk about aggression, there's lots of ways to categorize it. One way that anthropologists or social scientists will use is to talk about kind of hot versus cold, or reflexive versus premeditated aggression. And these are two different types. And on the one end, with like hot aggression or impulsive aggression, we are very, very low compared to other primates. We're classified as a primate. So one story, this comes from an anthropologist, Sarah Hurdy, who proposes this thought experiment. So suppose that you're trying to board a plane with 200 chimpanzees, right? You have 200 of these relatively impulsive primates all packed into this relatively small area. And you would be lucky to leave with like all 10 fingers and toes. There would be bloody earlobes, it would be a mess. And this is because chimpanzees have a generally much higher level of impulsive aggression. But fortunately, this sort of thing happens all the time in human societies where people with very, very, very few exceptions, people board and deplane an airplane with no altercation. But when you board an airplane, this is preceded by a very, very intensive security screening process. And the purpose of this is to weed out the cold aggression, the premeditated violence that unfortunately has happened. And it doesn't take long to think about, okay, well, there's 9/11 and these other instances where people with evil intent have tried to plan and carry out in a coordinated way, acts of violence. So we have a relatively low impulsive aggression. It's not zero, right? Certainly there's domestic violence, which a lot of times is kind of hot violence and aggression. But compared to kind of chimpanzees and bonobos, biologists tell us our closest biological relative, we're relatively low on that scale, which is obviously fortunate. But we carry out wars at a level that is not really seen in other organisms and in the biological world. So it's again this interesting, we're relatively peaceful, but we carry out warfare in a terrible way.
Right. It's a more sophisticated aggression,
planned and coordinated and premeditated,
and dangerous.
Yep.
Well, one thing I found interesting was the misconceptions around testosterone and aggression. Yeah. And we often think about one causal direction of this, which is that testosterone causes aggression. But can you talk a little bit about what's really probably happening?
Well, it looks like the arrows of causation go in both ways, right? And maybe one of the most observed ways this happens is that your environment can either kind of help upregulate or downregulate your testosterone, right? So, and even expectations. So some of this comes from, I'm a big fan of the writings of Robert Sapolsky, who's a Stanford biologist. And so Sapolsky lays out this scenario where, like, say you're running a marathon and you're expected to win, but you get, second or third place, then your testosterone may take a big dive. But like, say you weren't even expecting to finish and you come in like 100th place, that may be a big boost. And, so sometimes even just expectations can modulate levels of testosterone. Another way that this has been observed is in family relationships. So men, if they're, say, a first-time father and they are involved in the rearing of and caring of that child, their testosterone levels will drop quite a bit. So there is definitely a relationship between testosterone and aggression, but it's not, as most things in science and nature, it's not a simple more testosterone equals more aggression, right? That there, most people who have relatively high levels of testosterone are not like violent criminals, right?
Right. So you share some fascinating experiments to test this cooperation versus aggression, as is one a dominant force of human nature. And I recognize some of these that you talked about. So those of us who have studied psychology or sociology may be familiar. But could you get into the Robbers Cave experiment with the 12-year-old boys?
Yeah, the Robbers Cave experiment is a classic. You read about in a lot of, Psychology 101 textbooks. But this was carried out in the 1950s. And essentially what was done is that this probably wouldn't be allowed in research these days because of ethics boards and such. But you had, I think, about 22 boys that came for a summer camp in the mountains of Oklahoma or Arkansas. And the boys thought they were just, signing up for a summer camp for a week or so. but in reality, it was a psychological experiment. And the researchers were studying, group functioning. So on the first week or so, they just observed two different groups of boys, and they tried to match the boys as best they could. They were from middle class, relatively functional families, and so forth. The first week they just observed them, and the groups were in isolation, and the groups social norms and rules emerged, and there were kind of leaders and followers and such. And then they put the groups into conflict one with another, and they would have competitions that were kind of winner take all, things like tug of war, football, that sort of thing. And you saw the cooperation within the group increase as they were in conflict with the other group. And then the next kind of phase of the experiment was to try to figure out, okay, how can we, now these groups are in conflict, how can we direct them such that they're now in cooperation? And the conclusion of the experiments was that you had to have a shared goal, something that both groups cared about. You couldn't just put them side by side or make them interact more, because that would not necessarily erase the tensions that had arisen. But you had to have a shared goal. So they cut off the water supply that provided water to both of the groups. And so they worked together to restore that water supply. And so it was just this really interesting experiment where you could see that group identity could form very quickly and could be very powerful in the way that you treat people within your group and those without your group. So this gets into what's called in-group and out-group bias, a very well-observed and replicated psychological phenomenon.
Right. And we see it everywhere with sports team fans.
Politics.
Yes.
Nationalism, all sorts of, there are all sorts of ways that we define groups. And there's a part of that that's a little depressing, but I think the encouraging aspect is that we can fairly flexibly change the definition of what our group is, and we can draw larger and larger circles.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I do want us to get into how to really apply all of these ideas to how we live life, in our day-to-day. But I want to first get into another tiny question. Free will versus determinism, right?
Yeah.
So, but this is important in our discussion of the duality of human nature, because free will is what may be that force of teasing apart our dueling natures, right?
That's something that I argue, yes, is the case.
Well, and it's important, and I thought about this as a therapist myself, because it means that our conscious thoughts and intentions influence our behavior rather than this pure behaviorist approach where the environment completely determines how we behave. And you even include a little anecdote from B.F. Skinner's lab, how his students challenged the idea because they would see that there were some of the animals that did behave differently than expected.
Yeah. So just to give a little context, many of your listeners are probably familiar, but B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist who, everything was about conditioning, and that every behavior, everything we do was the result of conditioning to our environment. And he also, by the way, like a number of really smart people, he thought free will was an illusion. And the anecdote you're referring to is this, kind of half serious Harvard law of animal behavior, which states that, under controlled experimental conditions of temperature, time, light, feeding, and so forth, the organism will behave as it damn well pleases. And as far back as I could trace this came from Skinner's own lab, where people were trying to do these conditioning experiments, and they recognized that there's a limit. Conditioning certainly is a real principle, but not everything in behavior is controlled or influenced by conditioning. So I thought that was kind of richly ironic, right? That this semi-serious Harvard law of behavior came from Skinner's own kind of graduate students.
Could you talk about the concept of emergence? that ties into this?
Yes. So emergence is this notion that at different levels of nature, you have different laws and principles that hold, right? So, one of the most maybe prominent examples, you would think about life, right? And organisms, our bodies are made mostly of 4 atoms: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. I mean, they're all others as well, but in much smaller quantities. And the laws and principles that govern those molecules, it's hard to figure how do you get from there to life, right? We don't feel like we're just a concatenation of, molecules bouncing around. That's not how we consider ourselves. Let me just, there's a British writer, Bill Bryson, who he has this great kind of example of this. He's trying to estimate how much it would cost to buy the raw materials to make a human body. And it turns out the estimates for this range wildly. One estimate from the Royal Society of Chemistry calculates it would be like $150,000 to buy all the carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and other trace elements. The other estimate from PBS is a measly $168. But as Bryson puts it, no matter what you pay or how carefully you assemble the materials, you are not going to create a human being. You could call together all the brainiest people who are alive now or have ever lived and endow them with the complete sum of human knowledge, and they could not between them make a single living cell, never mind a human body. That is unquestionably the most astounding thing about us. We are just a collection of inert components, the same stuff you would find in a pile of dirt. The only thing special about the elements that make you is that they make you. That is the miracle of life. So, at the one level, it's chemistry, biochemistry, but you come up a couple levels and we have things like love and hate and jealousy and affection, and they're radically kind of different principles and phenomena that emerge as you go on from one level to the next. And just because you understand something at one level doesn't mean you can necessarily apply that same logic or principles to another level.
Well, and an example you give is the brain versus the mind.
Correct. Yeah. And that's the levels where I think there's the most gap in our understanding, right? So you were alluding to this earlier, how, we're not just the product of our environment, and we're certainly influenced our environment. And it's very obvious that the brain influences the mind. Right. If you're drunk, you're bathing your brain in alcohol, you're going to act and think differently than you do when you're sober. Right. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your thoughts do not also influence, pointing in the other direction, your behavior and so forth. So there's lots of, I would say, very compelling evidence from psychology that our thoughts influence our behaviors.
Absolutely. I mean, I do that every day.
Yes, but I think
it's complicated. It's very complicated.
And again, there's some very smart people who think that free will is an illusion. And I think part of they can't seem to get their head around is that the arrows of causation can go in both ways. And part of this, I think, is because these processes don't happen instantaneously, right? At one moment, you may have the brain influencing the mind and your thoughts. At another moment, though, you might have your thoughts influencing your brain and how you behave and so forth. So that's, I think, one reason that some very smart people get hung up on this issue of free will. It's just an illusion. The principle that we're kind of dancing around is the philosophical term for it is epiphenomenalism. So, some people think, okay, your thoughts, they're not really doing anything. They're not in charge in any way. They're just the byproducts of the mechanical gears of the brain that are turning. That's the notion of epiphenomenalism. But as far as I'm concerned, from psychological science, that essentially has been falsified. There's plenty of examples where the direction of causation flows from, mind to brain and thus body.
Right. I mean, I think there's evidence around how we're thinking affects the neurochemicals and what's happening with our neurons. So
there's a lot we don't understand about that dance. And
right.
This is essentially the hard problem of consciousness, which you might also call the mind-brain gap. We have no idea how, intangible things like thoughts, emotions, and feelings seem to kind of spring forth from physical things like nerves and transmitters and so forth. But they do, they do all the time. And it's, the fact that this happens every day in our lives doesn't make it any less wondrous or mysterious. But, it's a remarkable thing. I think the data for free will are fairly compelling.
Well, so tying together duality of human nature, free will, and finding a sense of purpose.
Yeah. So there's a sense of purpose, and then there's an overall purpose, and they're a little bit distinct. So let me talk first about the overall purpose, right? I had this notion when I was a medical student that, if I believe the theory of evolution, that means that, life has no purpose. We're just random accidents and so forth. And I wrote the book to say why I think that's wrong, which essentially brings together what we've touched upon, the duality of human nature, the dual potential of human nature, the sense that we have kind of good and evil inherent within us. We also have the ability to choose. And therefore, it seems like one of the purposes of our existence is to kind of choose between these competing natures within us. But there's this cliche motif that, when I used to watch cartoons when I was a kid, and you would sometimes see this maybe character walking down the street, there would be an angel on one shoulder and a little devil on the other. And I think that's maybe more true to life than we might acknowledge or realize, right? I think that one of the reasons we are here is to test our character. And it's a hard test, that's for sure. But there are ways that we can help ourselves. And when you now we're talking about, okay, like a personal sense of purpose and meaning. When you ask people, right, what makes life meaningful, overwhelmingly, the most common answer is their relationships with other people, and most especially their relationships with family. Okay, now family's for some people especially, it's a tricky topic, right? Now, some people, unfortunately, in a terrible tragedy, they are born into families that are not supportive or loving. But notwithstanding, most people, and you're a parent, you have children, I've got children. The most meaningful aspects of my existence revolve around my children. Work is also important. Work is a second, but in many surveys, it's half as meaningful as family. So I think that is a function of the way that nature shaped us. The strongest forms of love and affection and trust and loyalty and cooperation and so forth, all these good things that we think about when we think about human nature, the strongest forms of those have their origin in the way that nature shaped family relationships.
Well, first of all, this is really the underpinning of so much of what we talk about on this podcast, which is finding meaning in our lives. And relationships always rises to the top. I mean, this comes up over and over. It's what all the science shows. It's kind of common sense. We live it, right? And as a parent, I think there's a lot around the stress of parenting, and there's a lot of attention on that. Yet, it's in the high 90%. Parents would never not have their children. So there's that meaning that goes along with the challenge. There's a reward at a very deep level.
Yes, I totally agree. And some people might not like this argument, but I'm going to pull it back to evolution and say a lot of this is rooted in the work of a psychiatrist named John Bowlby, who was really the pioneer of attachment theory. And, he came of age at a time when kind of Freudian theories of analysis still had sway, and relationships were not seen as very important. They were just a means to an end. And Bowlby recognized, well, that doesn't really make any sense. And, among many of his observations, he noted that human infants are incredibly immature when they are born. And, those who study infant development will sometimes refer to the first, 3 to 6 months of life as the quote fourth trimester, because in essence we're born half baked, right? And so
Right. We're the most underdeveloped,
yes,
aren't we? Yes.
And there's advantages to that because we are most influenced by environment in the ways that we develop and unfold, but also we need help. And what Bowlby noticed is that, look, okay, yes, this human infant needs this incredibly intensive love and care and concern on the part of the parents. And it was adaptive for parents to develop this deep sense of love. And so those two are kind of intricately connected. So just as a counterpoint, if you don't mind, life would be very different, social life, if we were seahorses. Okay, that's a kind of an absurd, thought experiment. But, seahorses are different than humans in a number of ways. One of which is that males are pregnant in seahorses. This would obviously lead to some very different family leave policies. But another way that they're different is that after their offspring are born, they don't have any parental investment. They just kind of like, the babies are born and they're like, good luck, hope you don't get eaten, pass on my genes, right? And no one knows exactly what it's like to be a seahorse, but you can bet that they don't have a deep love and care for their children because that's just not the strategy, the biological strategy they have adopted. On the other hand, going back to us, that means that there is this connection. There's this inextricable connection between the deep love that we have for our children and the incredible challenge it is to raise them, right? And if you line up 100 parents and you ask them, what is the most challenging thing you've done? 99 are going to say, raise my kids. If you ask them, what's the most rewarding thing you've done? 99 of them will say, raise my kids, right? At the confluence of biology and psychology, you can't have this deep love without compelling sacrifice. This is almost like this cosmic or spiritual truth, right? Which I find fascinating.
Well, the other, I think, human truth or truth about humanity that shows up across hundreds of years is the power of love. And it sounds cheesy, even as I say it.
Yeah.
But think about all these ancient philosophers. And I mean, everything has come down to love is the root of healing and health and well-being.
Yeah.
And I think this ties into how really our social relationships, our family relationships are fundamental to everything, to the sense of well-being, to our feeling like we're living meaningful lives, and even a sense of purpose.
I totally agree. I really do.
Okay, so do you think we have answered what is the meaning of life?
It sounds very grandiose, and I know I'm trying to tackle a lot here, but I do have a conviction that the purpose of life is to choose between the good and evil within us. And the meaning of life, at least when you ask people, is to develop deep and abiding and loving relationships. That's what people report as the most meaningful aspects of their life. So maybe framed another way, the purpose of life is to overcome your weaknesses and to accentuate your strengths. It's not easy. And it's a journey of a lifetime. Pardon my cheesiness there, but that is, I think, a fundamental reason that we exist.
So these are a lot of really big ideas and theories and philosophies and huge fields of study that we're covering. What do we do in the day-to-day? Like, how do we take these ideas and apply them to living our life today?
Well, there's an aspect of human nature that's a little bit depressing, which is that we're not very good at predicting what's going to make us happy. This is related to what's called affective forecasting, right? And we need to continually remind ourselves of this, right? When you think about, what's going to what is it that drives you throughout the day? A lot of us who are work oriented, it's like, okay, I've got to finish my paper. I got to ship my product. I've got to respond to these emails. So, one, I think helpful exercise is to ask yourself, okay, if you found yourself at the end of the day with an extra hour or two, what would you do? Like some meeting just got canceled and you have a free chunk of time. Are you going to catch up on your emails, or are you going to read a book to your 3-year-old? Are you going to, work on some paper? Are you going to write a love letter to your spouse? Okay. When I conduct this exercise, honestly, it's sometimes disturbing because I'm not necessarily going in the ways that is going to lead to, deep and enduring happiness. I'm a religious person, and one of the reasons that I go to church every week is because there I'm reminded of the importance of relationships. And it's like, okay, it's not about your title. It's not about your job. I mean, those things are important. They have their place. You need to work and provide for your family. But at the end of the day, what matters, it's not going to be very likely at the end of your career, you're going to say, man, I wish I spent more time working on this project. You're going to say, I wish I spent more time with my children, with my grandchildren, whatever it is, because it's the relationships that are fundamental. But we have these cognitive illusions that sometimes lead us, again, kind of tied into our selfishness, right? You think it's all about me. I want to increase my status, increase whatever it is, my standing among other people. So I think just, going over this and over and over and over again, in my faith, there's this saying that the belief or faith has a short shelf life, and you kind of need to be reminded. And this, I think, applies to some of these principles where this belief that, or really this demonstrated observation that relationships are fundamental, you have to remind yourself of that over and over and over again. And so, whatever it is that you do, whether it's going to church, whether it's philosophical meditation, you need to continually remind yourself: are my decisions leading me in the way that at the end of my career, at the end of my life, I'm going to look back and say, I'm glad I spent that much time with my family, right?
Right.
So,
and we spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about values and living a values-aligned life. And I think that ties in as well as being reflective on what brings meaning to your life, who you want to be in the world, what kind of person you want to be, and then looking at how you're behaving each day in alignment or not with those values.
Yeah. There's no magic formula, right? Each couple has to negotiate how they share, domestic and work duties and so forth. There's no magic formula, but you always have to be, I think, assessing, is the balance right here? Is it, am I giving enough of myself to others? Am I also, you can't totally ignore your own needs, right? There's that tension. And
right. And we could get into how to even define selfish, right? Which I spend a lot of time in therapy encouraging, especially women, to be more selfish because there's this whole kind of socialization of not prioritizing our own needs. So
correct.
That's kind of.
And I what for me is helpful is to distinguish between selfishness and self-interest. Okay. So at least in a biological sense, selfishness is doing something for yourself at the expense of others. And self-interest is doing something for yourself, which is not necessarily bad. But it's, again, there's not a magic formula for, in this situation, do X. In that situation, it's a series of decisions that has to be lived out and acted upon. And there is balance.
Well, I think pulling all of this together again, attempting to pull all of this together, that when we think about all the influences on how we are feeling, acting, behaving, relating, we do have choices around what kinds of context we live in. So who do we get close to? What kind of people do we form close relationships with? And being attentive to that is part of this free will of choosing what brings out the best of me, essentially, of my human nature. And then that helps me live a better life.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
I got it. Did I get it?
So. Yeah.
Well, Sam, thank you for this fascinating contemplation on the meaning of life and the role of evolution in our human search for a sense of purpose. I really appreciate you taking the time to get deep about these existential questions that are so universal. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
There's a website we made for the book, samueltwilkinson.com. You can look me up on my Yale faculty page. Just search for Yale and Samuel Wilkinson. I'm not on a lot of social media. That's good for mental health, not great for business, but
but for your own meaningful life.
I am on LinkedIn if people want to connect with me there. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.